Hello and welcome to today's class in the Alchemy of Genius program. I'm excited to share with you a profound journey from psychological bondage to authentic bonding. Today we'll be exploring the unconscious bonds that foreclose on soul-making. This is not about fun bonding, it's truly about bondage and how to transform it. I'll introduce you to three important concepts: the fantasy bond, the trauma bond, also known as the betrayal bond, inner bonding. We'll also explore Jung's Transcendent Function and the tension of opposites that allows us to move beyond our psychological bondage. But before we dive in, let's clarify what we mean by psychological bondage and one-sidedness. The core of our discussion today revolves around one-sidedness, the limited perspective of the ego that keeps us in bondage. Jung writes in his essay on the Transcendent Function, one-sidedness is an unavoidable and necessary characteristic of the directed process, for direction implies one-sidedness. He continues, civilized life today demands concentrated, directed conscious functioning, and this entails the risk of a considerable dissociation from the unconscious. Here's the key insight. The greater the power of one-sidedness, the greater the counterposition in the unconscious. This one-sidedness is maintained by our defense mechanisms, which we discussed in our previous class. These defenses create the illusion that we are only our conscious self, our ego, but this creates a shadow position in the unconscious. So what's happening here? We have a false idea of the self as ego, and this one-sidedness runs the show. Meanwhile, in the unconscious, we have the true self, our soul, our inner child, both protected and persecuted in what I call the crypt of bondage. The inner child is protected from death but dissociated from life. I would posit that it is this duo in the crypt, the protective and persecutory forces, that actually runs the show from behind the scenes. Our task is to rescue the inner child from its protective bondage. Let me expand on the Axiom of Maria, a key alchemical formula that illuminates our psychological development. The axiom states, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. In psychological terms, this describes the journey of consciousness. 1 becomes 2. We begin in unconscious wholeness, then experience a split into conscious and unconscious, into light and shadow, into ego and other. This differentiation is necessary for consciousness. 2 becomes 3. When we hold the tension between these opposites without collapsing back to one-sidedness, a third element emerges, the transcendent function, which reconciles the opposites into a new synthesis. From the third comes the one as the fourth. This new synthesis isn't a return to the original unconscious unity, but a higher order consciousness that includes both the original positions and their reconciliation. What happens in psychological bondage is that we experience the split from 1 to 2, but then use defense mechanisms, repression, denial, projection, to artificially collapse back to a false one-sidedness. The ego pretends it's whole by itself and denies the other. In this state, the ego believes it is a god, sufficient unto itself. But true development requires embracing the tension of 2, allowing 3 to emerge, and ultimately reaching the fourth, genuine individuation. This is the path to liberation we'll explore today. To overcome our one-sidedness, we must learn to hold the tension of opposites. This requires becoming aware of the opposites, particularly the unconscious pole, holding them in tension with our witness mind, allowing the third, what Jung calls the transcendent function, to reconcile this duality, expanding our consciousness. For the purposes of today's work, I've created this model to guide us. Most of us are identified with our personalities, what Jung calls the persona. These are the masks we wear when interacting with the outside world. Until you begin to do inner work, you will believe you are your mask, your personality, opposed to the persona is the shadow. Whatever does not conform to the outer world's view of who we should be gets tossed into the shadow. This corresponds to Freud's conception of the ego and the id. The new piece we're examining today is the trickster, the ambivalent character that mediates between our conscious and unconscious selves. The trickster acts as both protector and persecutor, controlling what goes on in the psyche, especially when our witness self is not activated. The trickster corresponds to Freud's superego and what others call the inner critic. The Phantom of the Opera begins and ends with the auctioning of a monkey music box, a perfect symbol for the trickster archetype. The trickster is half animal and half god, representing our ambivalent bondage. The trickster is so one-sided that it has no moral compass. It personifies ambivalence and acts as the gatekeeper to real change. We will always face the trickster as we attempt to make significant changes in our lives. The trickster is a shapeshifter, animal, man, woman, God, very mercurial in nature, connected to Mercury and Chiron in astrology. Jungians use stories, myths, and fairy tales to understand archetypes. Today we'll examine the character of Christine in The Phantom of the Opera, as she transforms from bondage to bonding. The Phantom of the Opera is a novel by French author Gaston Leroux, published from 1909 to 1910. It became the longest-running show in Broadway history after Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical debuted in 1988. To me, this story parallels the abduction of Persephone by Hades, the mythic expression of the Eleusinian mysteries from ancient Greece. I fell in love with this story when the movie came out in 2004 and nearly wrote my dissertation on it. The story begins with Christine replacing the lead singer on opening night. She sings Think of Me, a song about lost love. Think of me waking, silent and resigned. Imagine me trying too hard to put you from my mind. Recall those days, look back on all those times. Think of the things we'll never do. There will never be a day when I won't think of you. Notice she wears white, representing her innocence, naivete, and virginal quality. She symbolizes complete identification with the persona and one-sidedness. We learn that Christine was orphaned around age 8, became a chorus girl, and lived in the opera house. She was taken in by Madame Giry and raised alongside her daughter Meg. Her father, a famous violinist, loved her deeply. As the story progresses, we discover Christine believes her father sent an angel of music from heaven to tutor her. This illustrates the fantasy bond, an imaginary relationship created to avoid the pain of loss. The fantasy bond primarily begins with the creation of an imaginary mother who meets our needs when the real mother fails to do so. It's an illusion created to alleviate pain and suffering. This mechanism continues into our adult relationships. We remain engulfed by our fantasies of love, trying to find suitable candidates to carry our projections, often with great heartache. We don't recognize this pattern because it's a deeply entrenched unconscious process, a failure of ego-relatedness. Our need for belonging and connection, when unmet, creates a fantasy. In this state, we remain stuck in the sympathetic fight-or-flight response, never risking true relationship and intimacy through the ventral vagal system. Let me elaborate on this critical distinction. The ventral vagal system is the evolved part of our autonomic nervous system. When we operate from this system, we can be present with others without fear or defense. We can attune to others' emotional states while maintaining our boundaries. We experience genuine connection, compassion, and co-regulation. We can access higher cognitive functions and our spiritual nature. We have the capacity to be vulnerable authentically, not from woundedness. This is the neurological foundation for true bonding, both with others and with our higher self. But when early attachment is disrupted, we default to sympathetic arousal, fight-flight, or dorsal vagal collapse, freeze, dissociation. The fantasy bond actually prevents activation of the ventral vagal system because it keeps us relating to projections rather than real others. Our inner emptiness, that void we fear threatens our annihilation, was created by our original mothering failures and does not support positive ego growth. Our relational development remains arrested in infancy, operating in fight or flight and through fantasy bonds. This is another perspective on Jung's concept of one-sidedness. Let me share a quote from Robert Firestone's book, The Fantasy Bond. The primary fantasy bond is an illusion of connection, originally an imaginary fusion or joining with the mother's body, most particularly the breast. It is a core defense and is protected by other patterns of thoughts and behavior, secondary fantasies. It is not bonded as in bonding, maternal-infant attachment in a positive sense, nor does it refer to a relationship that includes loyalty, devotion, and genuine love. Our concept of the fantasy bond uses bond rather in the sense of bondage or limitation of freedom. The fantasy bond is a substitute for the love and care. It is created to deal with the intolerable pain and anxiety that arise when the infant is faced with excessive frustration. As the story continues, Christine wakes in a fog in the phantom's lair, reminiscent of Persephone's abduction by Hades. The phantom sings, "I've brought you to the seat of sweet music's throne, to this kingdom where all must pay homage to music. You have come here for one purpose and one alone. Since the moment I first heard you sing, I have needed you with me, to sing for my music." Here, the phantom reveals his narcissistic intention to keep Christine imprisoned to serve his needs. This parallels our inner innocent child imprisoned by the protector persecutor. The fantasy bond of an angel of music, created to assuage the suffering of her father's death, now reveals the other side of this bargain. This is what happens in the unconscious if we don't awaken. Our energy is used for purposes beyond our control. After the phantom kills Bouquet, Raoul sings to Christine, "No more talk of darkness. Forget these wide-eyed fears. I'm here. Nothing can harm you. My words will warm and calm you. Let me be your freedom. Let daylight dry your tears. I'm here with you, beside you, to guard you and to guide you." Christine responds, "All I want is freedom, a world with no more night, and you always beside me to hold me and to hide me." Can you see the one-sidedness in both of them? Raoul's intention seems protective, but is it truly liberating or just another form of confinement? The phantom, enraged, sings, "I gave you my music, made your song take wing, and now how you've repaid me, denied me, and betrayed me. He was bound to love you when he heard you sing." Raoul and Christine then sing together, "Say you'll share with me one love, one lifetime. Say the word, and I will follow you. Share each day with me, each night, each morning." This clearly demonstrates codependence, another form of bondage. The phantom threatens, "You will curse the day you did not do all that the phantom asked of you." This creates a split in Christine. The bonding begins to become conscious. She's falling in love with her childhood sweetheart, while the bond with the phantom transforms from an angel in heaven to a jealous lover. In an earlier scene, the phantom calls to her, "Insolent boy, this slave of fashion, basking in your glory, ignorant fool, this brave young suitor, sharing in my triumph." Christine answers, "Angel, I hear you speak, I listen, stay by my side, guide me, angel, my soul was weak, forgive me, enter at last, master." She prays for the materialization of the angel, and the phantom responds tellingly, "Flattering child, you shall know me, see why in shadow I hide, look at your face in the mirror, I am there inside." This perfectly illustrates the fantasy bond. It grows stronger as it's threatened by a real relationship in the outer world. 6 months later, Christine and Raoul are engaged. At a masquerade ball, everyone sings, "Masquerade, paper faces on parade, masquerade, hide your face so the world will never find you." Everyone wears masks, their personas. And suddenly, the angel-turned red devil appears with an opera called Don Juan Triumphant, starring Christine and himself as the hero. In Jungian terminology, we're witnessing the persona meeting the shadow, the beginning of a split that can heal one-sidedness. Christine gains enough self-awareness to follow her intuition to her father's grave. From a trauma healing perspective, this represents returning to the original wound rather than focusing on its repetitions. She sings, "You were once my one companion. You were all that mattered. You were once a friend and father. Then my world was shattered. Wishing you were somehow here again. Wishing you were somehow near. Sometimes it seemed if I just dreamed, somehow you would be here." She continues, "No more memories, no more silent tears, no more gazing across the wasted years. Help me say goodbye." Christine intuitively understands she must individuate from her father and move beyond the angel of music. She cannot have an intimate relationship with Raoul unless she properly mourns her father's loss. Otherwise, Raoul will merely become a projection of her lost father. The phantom appears at the graveyard singing, "Wandering child, so lost, so helpless, yearning for my guidance." Christine responds, conflicted, "Wildly my mind beats against you." The phantom acknowledges, "You resist." Yet together they sing, "Yet the soul, obeys." Christine is once again transfixed by the fantasy of an angel saving her from her father's loss, captured by false magic and trickery. Trauma bonding, or betrayal bonding, happens when we continue to deny the harm another causes in our lives. Or worse, we don't even recognize it as trauma because we've normalized it. We become programmed to deny pain, to interpret fear or terror as bonding, to equate pain with pleasure, or to believe that someone hurting us means they care and we deserve it. This phenomenon is more common than most people realize. I believe many religions exhibit trauma bonding patterns, and citizens often trauma bond with political leaders. Patrick Carnes writes in The Betrayal Bond, "You will never mend the wound without dealing with the betrayal bond. You cannot walk away from it. Time will not heal it. Burying yourself in compulsive and addictive behaviors will bring no relief, just more pain. Being crazy will not make it better. No amount of therapy, long-term or short-term, will help without confronting it. Your ability to have a spiritual experience will be impaired. Any form of conversion or starting over only postpones the inevitable, and there's no credit for feeling sorry for yourself. You must acknowledge, understand, and come to terms with the relationship." The phantom seduces Christine further. "You have come here in pursuit of your deepest urge, in pursuit of that wish which till now has been silent. I've brought you that our passions may fuse and merge. In your mind, you've already succumbed to me, dropped all defenses, completely succumbed to me." Do you see the gaslighting, the codependence, the narcissistic control? He continues, "Past the point of no return, no backward glances. The games we've played till now are at an end. Past all thought of if or when, no use resisting. Abandon thought and let the dream descend." Together they sing, "Past the point of no return, the final threshold. The bridge is crossed, so stand and watch it burn. We've passed the point of no return." The trauma bond happens on both sides. The abuser is fused physiologically with the victim as much as the victim is fused with the abuser. Notice how Christine moves in and out of trances. Finally, Christine awakens. "Have you gorged yourself at last in your lust for blood? Am I now to be prey to your lust for flesh?" The phantom responds, "That fate which condemns me to wallow in blood has also denied me the joys of the flesh. This face which earned a mother's fear and loathing, a mask, my first unfeeling scrap of clothing." Christine delivers the crucial insight. This haunted face holds no horror for me now. It's in your soul that the true distortion lies. The trance is broken. She clearly sees him for who he is. She is no longer unconsciously bonded to him through mutual wounding, having understood the origin of this bondage to be the loss of her father. We arrive at the tension of opposites when Raoul attempts to save Christine but ends up captured himself. The Phantom delivers an ultimatum. Start a new life with me. Buy his freedom with your love. Refuse me, and you send your lover to his death. This is the choice. This is the point of no return. Christine responds, the tears I might have shed for your dark fate grow cold and turn to tears of hate. Raoul laments, I fought so hard to free you. The Phantom demands, you've passed the point of no return. You try my patience. Make your choice. Then comes Christine's transformative moment. Pitiful creature of darkness, what kind of life have you known? God, give me courage to show you you are not alone. She kisses him passionately, not out of romantic love, but from compassion and strength. By facing this demon fully and seeing it wholly for what it is, she is released from bondage and fully empowered. This is not a fairy tale ending where the damsel is rescued by a knight on a white horse. This is a story of a woman's individuation from patriarchal bondage into her full strength and authority. Remember, the story begins and ends with the monkey music box, the trickster. The superego, or inner critic, stands against the expansion of consciousness. It substitutes rules for direct experience, keeping us in bondage. The best approach to decreasing its power is to replace it with awareness and witnessing as much as possible, ultimately dethroning it. This is our work, to break the bondage with the phantom, trickster, protector, persecutor inside that unconsciously runs everything in our psyche. We must understand, acknowledge, and come to terms with this part of ourselves. This corresponds to what Freud called the superego, what others call the inner critic or judge. To move from bondage to bonding requires recognizing our one-sidedness and the fantasy bonds we've created, confronting the original wounds rather than their repetitions, breaking through the trauma bonds that keep us captive, holding the tension of opposites until the transcendent function emerges, engaging with our inner trickster from a place of witness consciousness, moving beyond protection and persecution to true freedom. This journey from bondage to bonding is the core of soul making, allowing us to recover our authentic self from the crypt and engage with life from wholeness rather than fragmentation. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. Did you notice that at the end of The Phantom of the Opera, the Phantom slithers away after releasing Christine? He doesn't truly disappear, he transforms. This slithering image leads us perfectly into our next class where we'll examine Prince Lindworm, another story of transformation. In Prince Lindworm, we encounter a serpent-like creature who must be confronted not through rejection, but through a specific ritual of transformation. It continues our exploration of the trickster archetype and shows how the phantom aspects of ourselves can be resurrected into more integrated forms. We'll delve deeper into practical methods for inner bonding and working with the transcendent function, focusing on how the shadow elements we've identified today can be transformed rather than simply banished. The slithering phantom and the Lindworm represent the same psychological pattern from different cultural perspectives, and together they teach us the full cycle of psychological transformation. Until next time, I encourage you to notice the phantom elements in your own life, those aspects of yourself or your relationships that may be operating from fantasy or trauma bonds rather than authentic connection through the ventral vagal system.